Tonight, talking about being countercultural in our goals. Like Dad said this morning, this is the final lesson in the series. We had 5 lessons on Christians being countercultural, and this all stems from Romans chapter 12 in verse 2. Paul says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." We zeroed in on the first part of this verse that talks about don't be conformed to the world. Christians aren't supposed to fit the mold that the world has for mankind. Amen. Rather, Christians are supposed to be transformed by God, by Christ, or by, this verse says, the renewal of our mind. So Christians, on a basic understanding of what a Christian is, they are going to be different from the world. And we've explored that in a couple of different ways. We mentioned 5 different ways. First of all, we said the first lesson was about how a Christian speaks. We're countercultural in our speech. And we spent a little time talking about how there are things Christians do say, and there are things Christians don't say, right? Christians don't let unwholesome things come out of their mouth. But Christians let things that build others up come out of their mouth constantly, like it says in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 29. And we finished up looking at how powerful of a tool words are. God gave us this incredibly powerful, the same tool that God used to create the world, he entrusted us with to be ministers of his. And so Christians ought to look different when it comes to how we talk. Our speech should be countercultural. The second thing we looked at was consumption. And this was kind of an odd title, but the idea really was, what are Christians putting into their body and mind that makes them look different than the world? And we talked specifically, and we spent a good amount of time on what we put in our minds. We spent a little bit of time on what we put in our bodies, and we talked about how Christians are, supposed to take care of their bodies, but Christians are allowed to feast. The Jews, God's chosen people, feasted all the time. And then we spent the bulk of the time talking about things that Christians put into their mind are countercultural. We don't just put in whatever we want. We don't just watch anything on TV. We aren't obsessed with the bad news that's constantly on the news channels, right? We're not putting in these negative things, but like Philippians 4 and verse 8 says, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is above reproach, whatever is good, whatever is lovely, meditate on these things. And we spent a little bit of time talking about if a Christian is going to be countercultural in what they are consuming, they're going to be putting good things into their bodies and especially into their minds, and they're going to meditate, take quiet time, and think on those things. The third lesson was countercultural in our appearance. And we went a little bit the normal direction with this and talked about how Christians ought to be modest, and people should be able to tell that you're a Christian in some semblance by the way that you dress. But we also went a little bit different direction and just said, plain old flat out, Christians look different. Right? Christians look different. I don't remember if we used muscle and a shovel as an example, but it's a great example of Christians looking different, being countercultural in appearance. In the book, Muscle and a Shovel, there's a man who's not actually named Randall. He's one of the characters in the book, and Randall is such a different person. He's more joyful, he's more outgoing, he's more giving, he's kinder, he has no reason to do any of these things other than the fact that he's a Christian. And the author of the book, Michael Shank, can tell he's different. His appearance was countercultural to that of everyone else. And Christians, if we're going to be countercultural, we're just going to look different. We're going to act different. We're going to treat people differently. And then the last one that we looked at was countercultural in relationships. And this lesson, we really emphasized on the fact that Christians are meant to be people who give in relationships, not take from relationships. Christians are people who are concerned with serving others and loving others. And if you remember, I told my friend's story about a young man named Maxime, who was so giving of himself that it ultimately potentially even cost him his life. And on the day that he died, many people who he served throughout his life came to know Christ and to be baptized into Christ just because he was so different in the way that he was in his relationships. He was such a giving person that set the example and really showed what it is to be countercultural in our relationships. Christians are supposed to be givers and not just takers. That brings us to our lesson tonight, which is countercultural in our goals. And there are a lot of different, as I was thinking about the lesson, there were a lot of different directions I felt like we could take this lesson. When you think about having goals that are different than our culture, the first thing that comes to my mind is, well, what are some of our culture's goals? And then as I was talking through it, what do you call it, a trend? A trend came to my mind, a hashtag, right? Have you guys seen, hashtag, have you all seen the hashtag goals on people's pictures before? Maybe you're not familiar. Let me put it this way. If you are at the gym and you see a guy who is just incredibly fit, right, has it all put together, he's strong and he's lean and he's fast, and you're like, oh man, goals, right? That's all you have to say. This is pop culture. We don't have to speak in full sentences. We just say goals, right? And we point to that guy. What it means is, I hope to get there someday, right? Or maybe you see a family and they have 5 beautiful children who are grown up and successful, and you look at that and you say, oh, goals, right? I mean, this is a common thing. Sometimes people will post pictures of something cool and they'll say goals, right? Or they'll post a picture of an accomplishment like a mountain that they want to hike and they'll say goals. Courtney follows this girl on Instagram named Erin Williams, who apparently takes trips to Disney with regularity. Once a month, I think she told me, roughly. Right? She has the privilege to go to Disney World once a month. And Courtney, every single time this girl goes to Disney World and posts about it, shows me the phone and says, goals, every time, right? What's she saying? She's saying, someday I hope I can go to Disney World once a month, right? I don't know about that happening, but, I remember seeing a picture one time, just one more funny one. I saw a picture one time of a family of 4, and the dad and the mom and the 2 children, and all of the members in the family had matching Jordans, shoes. They had matching Michael Jordan shoes, and I just looked at it and I said, Court, goals, all right? Like that was what I showed it to her. Listen, in our world, that is kind of how we think of our goals. We see something we like, we see something we want, and we're like, man, I want to get there. That's where I'd like to be. I remember a friend of mine one time said, I hope someday I have a road named after me. And I thought he was ridiculous, but he was saying like, man, LBJ Freeway, wouldn't it be cool to have a road named? So he looked at that and he said, goals. So I want to know, how would you look at someone whose mother had a reputation for being promiscuous? Would you look at them and say goals? Or what about somebody who was constantly being endorsed by homeless, crazy people who ate bugs? Would you look at them and say, yeah, I want to be like that, goals, right? I mean, let's put this into perspective. The homeless guy with a cardboard sign on the corner of the street in downtown Dallas says, Joseph Lewis, y'all should listen to him. Goals, right? That doesn't exactly seem like someone we would want to listen. That doesn't exactly seem like a goal that many of us would have. And yet these are things that are true about Jesus. He was endorsed by a homeless man who ate bugs named John the Baptizer. His mother was fairly well known that he was born before his parents were married and might have had a reputation in that regard. Now listen, there are a lot of things about Jesus that we would not look at and say goals. However, we should. I'm going to look at 4 things, and coincidentally, the 4 things we're going to look at about Jesus are going to line up perfectly with the way this series has gone. So we're going to look at Jesus in his speech, in his consumption, in his appearance, and in his relationships. And we're going to see if these are goals that we would naturally have. And if they're not, we're going to make the case that they should be, all right? So let's start with the first one. Jesus was countercultural in his speech. I think we looked at it a little bit when we had this lesson 3 or 4 months ago. But Jesus' speech was different, right? People could tell that there was something different about Jesus in the way that he spoke. He challenged people with his words, right? He spoke, the Pharisees are appalled at him because he speaks as one who has authority, right? Only they're allowed to do that. Jesus' words were countercultural. Look at 1 Peter chapter 1. 1 Peter 1 and verse 22. Oh, 2, I'm so sorry. 1 Peter 2 and verse 22. Like father, like son, huh? 1 Peter 2 and verse 22 says, he committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. Now take a second, and we say this a lot, right? I feel like we do this with Jesus all the time. We take almost all of the humanity out and just repeat the phrases that we've known our whole life. When we say there was no deceit found in Jesus' mouth, what are we saying? Put that in English. He never lied, right? Now imagine someone being able to say, that guy never lies. Let's take a second. Jesus was so countercultural in his speech that he never told something that wasn't true, which means, unlike me, he never came back to a church that he had preached at before and said, hey, I want to let you know, Luke was not a Jew, Luke was a Gentile, right? I got that wrong last week. Jesus never did that, okay? Jesus never came into a town and said, hey, last time I was here, I needed to get on the road, so I didn't give you the right answer to that. I just gave you the answer to get out quick. He never lied. Never was dishonest, never deceived anyone, right? That's what this verse says. No deceit was found. Just imagine someone whose words were so accurate, so important, so true, that you didn't have to say, are you sure? You never had to say, really? You didn't have to question them for a second because you knew they have not ever said something that was untrue. Listen, this is radically countercultural. Jesus' speech was different. And now, we may look at that, and this one, we may look at that and say goals. Until we get into some situations where we feel like we probably shouldn't tell the truth, right? And I mean, I'm getting some perplexed looks, but the classic example, does this dress make me look fat? I had the scenario happen to me today. The answer was absolutely not. My wife looks amazing. But listen, sometimes there are scenarios, there are questions that are asked of us. There are things that are brought to our attention, situations in life, and it really looks like the right answer is the wrong answer, doesn't it? And yet, even in those situations, I want to give you an example. I watched a TED Talk recently. The TED Talk was titled, Great Leaders Do What Drug Addicts Do. Of course, that caught my attention right away. TED Talks are awesome. So I watched it. It was about 17 minutes long, and it's a guy who said, I am a recovering drug addict, and in Narcotics Anonymous, they teach you a couple of steps. The first step is ultimate honesty, relinquishing of the outcomes, and I can't remember the third step, but those two were really important. So essentially, this guy started a business that had to do with medical equipment. And as he's about to sign the deal of his life, right? He's given up his life savings, put it all into this business, and he's about to sign a deal with these hospitals that is going to set him up for life. He gets a read back on one of the pieces of equipment that he has, and it says one of them failed. It was just one. It was really minor. They could have lied about it. It wouldn't have been a big deal. Honestly, in that situation, he probably, I don't want to say should have, but set for life because you have a deal with hospitals that they're going to use your software, or tell them that it failed once. He said he worried about that decision for a couple of weeks before the deal was about to go through. And then finally, he was at another NA meeting, and he heard the person he was sponsoring say, I had this decision. And he gave the person he was sponsoring advice that you have ultimate honesty and you relinquish the outcomes. And he said, in that moment, I knew exactly what I had to do. I went home that night and I called the hospital that we were about to do the deal with, and I told them, honestly, we had one of our systems fail, and nothing happened, and everything was fine, but we did have it fail. He said on the other end of the phone, all he heard was laughing. He said that the hospital director said, listen, there are countless numbers of these that fail on a daily basis. We thought when you said you had a problem that it was a couple thousand failures or a real major issue. There are probably little things like this that go under our radar every day. And if anything, the fact that you brought this to our attention has shown us that we can absolutely trust you in any situation. Listen, he relinquished the outcome, even in a situation where it would have absolutely benefited him not to. He was truthful, even when being set for life, having his business validated, and all of his hard work come to fruition was on the table. And because he did that, because this man didn't allow deceit to come from his mouth, he was incredibly blessed. He got the deal with the hospital. They used his software, as far as I understood from the video, still. Now, I say all this to say, Jesus never lied. And even in situations in our life where it seems like what is in our best interest to do is to lie, Jesus didn't lie. And we ought to be able to look at that and say that those are our goals. Jesus' words also led to life. John 6 and verse 68, Peter says, "To whom shall we go? You have the words of life." Jesus' words were words that led to life. His speech was countercultural. He didn't tear down. It didn't bash. It didn't hurt. It led to life. The next thing. Jesus' speech was countercultural, and we ought to be able to look at it and say that those are our goals. Second thing was Jesus' consumption was countercultural. And what I really mean by this is that he didn't really consume much. All right, you think about this. Jesus, when it came to accumulating wealth or possessions or having things or having nice things or having functional things, like Jesus didn't have things. Look at Matthew chapter 8. Matthew chapter, it's a verse I'm sure that we're familiar with, but Matthew chapter 8, Jesus is, he's at sort of the beginning of his ministry, and there are some people who are wanting to follow him. Verse 19 says, "And a scribe came up and said to him, 'Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go.'" Man, what do you think the scribe was expecting on the back end of that? Awesome. That's awesome, man. Come on. The more the merrier. How? You are really righteous, Mr. Scribe. Like, what do you think he was anticipating the response to that would be? Probably not what it was, okay? Jesus responds to, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." And Jesus said to him, "Foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." I'm sorry. What? Listen, I don't know if you really grasp what Jesus says here, because like I said, we have a tendency to sort of sanitize these very human things that Jesus said. He just told the man, "I'm homeless. You want to follow me? That's great, but I'm homeless. Foxes have a home, and birds have a home. I don't have a home. So come on and follow me." Right? Listen, just imagine for a second if, we have to hire a new preacher. And our new preacher says, "Listen, church, I don't want to drain the church's finances. I want that money to be used to further the kingdom, and I don't need it. And so give it to something else, and I'm good," right? Wouldn't that be great? A preacher who was so not materialistic that he said, "My support comes elsewhere, I'll be great." But then you find out that he's actually, on his good nights, staying in houses of the members of the church on the couch, and on his bad nights, he's camping in a tent. How would you feel about that preacher? I'd think it was weird, all right? I'm just going to be honest with you. I'd be like, why didn't you just have the church pay for a house? Like, that's reasonable, isn't it? Listen, Jesus may not have been homeless in the sense that we think of it, but he was certainly homeless in the sense of he didn't have a home, right? At best, when Jesus was staying in a city, he had a place that was not his own that he was staying, right? At worst, when Jesus was traveling from city to city, he was staying outside in tents. I don't think it's a far stretch to say Jesus was homeless. So when we talk about being countercultural in consumption, like I said, it's my birthday today. You know what I did a couple days before my birthday? I told my mom and my sisters and my wife, hey, here are some things that I would like for my birthday. Now, none of you have a problem with that, but I feel kind of guilty saying that in the middle of this lesson, right? Listen, we have a natural tendency to accumulate things. As we go through our life, we collect things. Storage companies have a business because people have a tendency to collect things, all right? We have a tendency to retain, well, some of us don't retain wealth, but we have a tendency to have income and to hang on to things and to consume physical material things. Jesus did not. The way that he consumed was drastically countercultural. He was homeless. He stayed the night with other people. He camped out in tents when he traveled. He sojourned from city to city. Listen, we often would probably not look at Jesus being homeless and say goals, would we? But maybe we should. You think about this. Jesus had fame, right? And he never monetized it. Did you know if you get enough people to watch your YouTube videos, you can get paid for it? You don't have to do anything crazy. You just have to get people. There are people who all they do is hold their iPhone up to their face throughout the day. At the end of the day, they upload the hour-long video of all the footage they had, and they have millions of people who just watch that happen. They're just watching people live their life, and they get paid for it, right? Because if you have something like that, if you have a skill, then you want to get paid for it. That's human tendency. Jesus had fame in the whole region. People were flocking to him. He fed 5,000 men, potentially as many as 15,000 people on that day who are sitting and listening to him. And he never made money from it, never monetized it. He was countercultural in his consumption by being homeless. Now, we don't look at that and say goals, but again, maybe we should. The third thing, Jesus was countercultural in his appearance. Look at Matthew chapter 9. Just a page over from where we were. Matthew chapter 9. Let's look at start in verse 9. It says, as Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, follow me. And Matthew rose and followed him. And Jesus reclined at table in the house. Behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? But when he heard it, he said, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. So, again, man, how many times have we heard Jesus ate with tax collectors and sinners? I mean, I've heard that my whole life. You know what it's meant to me? Very little, all right? I really didn't understand it because it's just, like, what is even a tax? So he ate with the IRS? I can't imagine they're a lot of fun people, but still, that just doesn't resonate with me, you know? I want to put it in a little bit different perspective, okay? Jesus was eating with the outcasts and what would be considered socially some of the worst kind of people. So we're going back to our imaginary preacher that we just hired, okay, who's homeless. And now you're hearing that he's hanging out at the party house in town, right? He's spending his Friday nights at that house over on the hill, back up in the trees, where they party. And you haven't heard that he is partying, but you know they party hard up at that house. And he's up there eating a meal with those people, and there aren't very good people up there. We would be very unsettled by this, wouldn't we? I know the scenario is not perfect because we live in a really big town and there are probably more party houses than we can count in our big town. But listen, well, I know my dad shared this before, so I can share it as well. My grandparents, before they were Christians, had a house up on a hill, kind of on the edge of town, where they would throw parties. And there would be a lot of sinful stuff going on at those parties. And it was not uncommon for a lot of people to come to those parties. And the way my dad describes it, and I've never heard anyone else use this phrase, but he describes it as parties with, quote, kegs of beer on ice. It rings in my head sometimes when I hear that story. Now imagine Jesus going to a party where there were kegs of beer on ice. The tax collectors would have drank. I mean, I don't think you can really get around that. The tax collectors and sinners likely were the people who partied. These are not quality moral people that Jesus is in a house eating with. And if that wasn't clear by the phrase tax collectors and sinners, it should be clear by the Pharisees' response. They're astounded. What? They say, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? They can't believe it. They would never. Because honestly, most of us would never, right? I wouldn't want people knowing that I was going and hanging out at the party house. That would not look really good on me, right? But Jesus wasn't really concerned with his appearance in that way because he had a different mission. Put it in perspective, I couldn't think of a direct parallel for tax collectors, but imagine if our new pretend preacher was spending his time with this group of criminal defense lawyers who were notorious for getting pedophiles off the hook. Okay? Imagine if he was spending time with these criminal defense lawyers who were the guys who you knew if you committed a crime and you knew you were guilty and everyone else knew you were guilty, they would defend you, they would charge you a lot of money, and they got very wealthy because of this, and they would get you off. And Jesus is hanging out with these people who are traitors to society, letting criminals walk on the streets because they want the money from it. That's Matthew. He was a traitor to the Jewish society because it benefited him monetarily. All right? And then you hear that our new pretend preacher is actually, he's gotten one of those guys to come spend a lot of time with him. Right? The worst of those guys, one of those criminal defense lawyers who's notorious for getting criminals off, he's called one of those guys to be one of his best friends. So now your preacher is homeless, has a reputation for spending time with broken people, and one of his best friends is this awful criminal defense lawyer. I mean, goals? Maybe it should be. See, Jesus, when he came, he wasn't concerned with what the Pharisees thought of him. He was concerned with going to the broken people, which is why he says, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Now, I'm going to tell you, I think the reason Jesus spent his time with these particularly obviously broken people was in order to show everyone else that we're all actually broken people. I think the story of the prodigal son does a really good job of summing that up. But Jesus wasn't concerned with what it looked like. He was concerned with doing the right thing and going to the people who needed him. Number 4, relationships. Jesus was countercultural in his relationships. Like we mentioned, being countercultural means being a giver and not a taker. Just a couple verses later in Matthew chapter 9 and verse 18, says, while Jesus was saying these things to them, behold, a ruler came in and knelt before him, saying, my daughter has just died, but come and lay your hands on her, and she will live. And Jesus rose and followed him with his disciples. And behold, a woman who had suffered from a discharge of blood for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment. For she said to herself, if I only touch his garment, I will be made well. And Jesus turned and seeing her said, take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well. And instantly the woman was made well. And when Jesus came to the ruler's house, he saw the flute players and the crowd making a commotion. And he said, go away, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. But when the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl arose. And the report of this went through all that district. Now listen, not only does a man come to Jesus and say, hey, I need your help, my daughter is dead, right? That happens. And Jesus has the choice right there to give to this man or to not, right? He could have said, I've got other things to do. I'm going to this town next. Your town's not on the agenda. He had that choice, right? Because the man came and asked, come to my house, my daughter is dead. But in the middle of him going to this man, so he chose to give to this ruler, right? And he goes and he follows him to his, and in the middle of him going to his house, he doesn't give to the woman with the flow of blood, right? This was unconsensual, right? She reaches through the crowd and grabs his garment. I mean, not only was he constantly giving, he was constantly being taken from as well. Jesus, while he was on this earth, was giving to everyone, recklessly giving of himself to others. We probably don't look at that and say goals, right? We probably don't look at Philippians chapter 2 and verse 7 where it says that Christ emptied himself and say, he was empty, that's how I want to be. We probably don't look at Matthew chapter 20 and verse 28 and say, where Jesus says that the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life. We don't look at that and say, that's where I want to be, but maybe we should. Why was Jesus so countercultural? What was it about him that made him do these things that were so, radically different? It wasn't like Jesus was only a little bit different. Jesus was different in a way that these people at this time had not ever seen before. He was dramatically countercultural, from the way that he spoke, to the way that he didn't accumulate wealth, to the way that he looked and didn't care as to how he looked. You remember his appearance was not something that would be remarked about, right? He wasn't a beautiful man. He wasn't a particularly hideous man like John the Baptist kind of is portrayed. He was just a normal guy. He was countercultural in his relationships and the way that he constantly gave to people. So why was Jesus so countercultural? It's because his goals were countercultural. Look at John chapter 6. John chapter 6, verse 38. Jesus has just finished telling them that he is the bread of life. And in the middle of this, he says, verse 38, for I have come down from heaven not to do my own will, but to do the will of him who sent me. Jesus' goals were very simple. He was here to do what God wanted him to do. Because those were his goals, because those goals were countercultural. You notice he almost acknowledges that this is a different kind of goal, right? Because he says, I've come down from heaven not to do my own will. You all would expect me to want to do my own will because humans kind of naturally have a desire to do their own will. I say naturally because I have a 2-year-old, and she has a deep desire to do her own will at all times, okay? When Dad said she doesn't like being said no to, it's the truth, okay? She said no to a nap today. It was unpleasant. Anyway, so listen, he says humans have a desire to do their own will. I didn't come to do my own will like you would expect. I came to do God's will. Those were the goals of Jesus. And because those goals were so innately countercultural, it caused every other facet of his life to be countercultural. It caused his speech to be different, his consumption or lack thereof to be different. It caused his appearance to be different, and it caused his relationship to be different. So the challenge tonight is very simple. Are our goals countercultural? If we're going to take the name of Christ, if we're going to be Christians, or as I've said in the past, Christians, which is the same thing, but it says Christ instead of Christ. Anyway, if we're going to be Christians and we're going to be followers of Jesus Christ and we're going to take his name, right, our goals should be countercultural like his goals. Our goals should be to do the will of the Father. And if that is our ultimate goal, to do God's will, then we will speak differently. Our speech will be different. We'll speak the truth in love like Jesus did. We'll be poor in spirit and we'll consume the bread of life and not consume worldly possessions or negative things that we'll put into our mind. If our goal is to be doing the will of God, we're not going to be concerned with our outward appearance. but we're going to love broken people and encourage them to do better. We'll go to the sick who are in need of Christ. If we are going to have goals that are to do the will of God, we will give of ourselves recklessly with no expectation of repayment, just like Christ did. Christ's goals were simple. I'm here to do God's wills. And if our goals are going to be Christ's goals, and if we are going to live with these goals that are countercultural, the rest of our life should follow as well. It should be all of our goal to be able to say what 12-year-old Jesus said in Luke chapter 2, shouldn't it? Why are you looking for me? Didn't you know I had to be about my Father's business? 12 years old, right? 12 years old, Jesus said, I know what my goal is. So the question tonight is, what are your goals? Personally, individually, where are your goals? Because I know for myself, I often get lost looking at other targets. Sometimes my goals get slightly askewed. Sometimes my goals get majorly askewed, all right? Listen, sometimes our goals can get off track. But if our goals are going to be Christ's goals, then our goal as a Christian should be to do the will of our Father who is in heaven, just like Jesus understood at the age of 12. So if your goals haven't been on point recently, if you need to get back on track, that's what the church is for, all right? That's what God's given us his word for. That's what the church is for, is to be able to encourage each other to get back on track and head towards the one goal of doing God's will. If you're not a Christian and you don't know what God's will is, well, here's a really easy answer. I'll show you, all right? You can come forward, and there are several people who are happy to show you what your Bible says and show you what God's will is in the Scripture. Whatever you have need of this evening, whether it's to be more countercultural or to know Christ for the first time, you can come as we stand and as we sing.